The cathedral bells chimed 11 o'clock as Sophia Martinez stood frozen before the ornate mirror in the bridal suite. Her reflection stared back, a vision in ivory silk and grandmother's pearls, yet her eyes held the wild look of a caged bird. Through the stained-glass windows, she could hear the murmur of 300 guests, the soft notes of the string quartet, and her mother's sharp voice directing last-minute arrangements. Everything was perfect, exactly as planned for the past 18 months. Everything except the growing knot of dread in her stomach that had been tightening with each passing day. When her maid of honor knocked softly and announced it was time, Sophia felt something inside her snap. Without a word, she gathered the voluminous skirts of her designer gown, slipped out through the side door of the cathedral, and ran. The expensive heels clicked frantically against the cobblestones as she fled toward the waiting taxi, her veil streaming behind her like a banner of rebellion. She didn't look back at the Gothic spires or the life she was abandoning. She just ran. Sophia's hands trembled as she handed her passport to the airline agent, grateful she'd kept her maiden name on all her travel documents. The wedding dress drew stares and whispered conversations throughout the terminal, but she no longer cared about appearances. Using her personal credit card, the one James didn't know about, she purchased a one-way ticket to Barcelona, a city she'd dreamed of visiting since college, but never found the time. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using the money she'd saved for their honeymoon to escape the marriage itself. As she made her way through security, the weight of her decision began to settle. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from James, her parents, the wedding planner, an entire army of people demanding explanations she couldn't give. Finally, she turned it off and dropped it into the nearest trash bin. Whatever consequences awaited her return, they would have to wait. Right now, she needed distance, clarity, and the freedom to breathe without the suffocating weight of everyone else's expectations pressing down on her shoulders like lead. Gate 47 was surprisingly quiet for an international departure. With only a handful of passengers scattered across the waiting area, Sophia had claimed a corner seat, trying to make herself as invisible as possible despite the conspicuous wedding attire. She was attempting to gather the courage to call her sister when a shadow fell across her lap. Looking up, she found herself staring into the most striking pair of grey eyes she'd ever seen. The man was tall, impeccably dressed in what she recognized as a bespoke Italian suit, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, and strong features that belonged on magazine covers. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and wore an expression of genuine concern that seemed oddly out of place for a stranger in an airport. There was something magnetic about his presence, an air of quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. For a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with an inexplicable tension that made Sophia forget to breathe. When he finally smiled, a slow, devastating expression that reached his eyes, she felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that she hadn't even realized was closed. "You look like someone who's running away from something," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. Sophia bristled at the observation, even though it was entirely accurate. Before she could formulate a defensive response, he continued, "I'm Alexander Stone, and I have a proposition that might interest you." The name meant nothing to her, but something in his tone suggested it should. He gestured to the empty seat beside her, asking permission with raised eyebrows, rather than simply assuming it was granted. When she nodded, he sat with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of important people. From his briefcase, he withdrew a sleek tablet and a business card that felt expensive between her fingers. Alexander Stone, CEO, Stone Industries. The logo was familiar. She'd seen it on buildings throughout the city, on tech products, in financial news segments. This man wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of wealthy that moved markets and influenced governments. Yet here he sat, speaking to her as if they were old friends rather than complete strangers who'd met by chance in an airport gate, and she found herself leaning forward to hear what impossible thing he might say next. "I need a wife," Alexander said, with the same casual tone someone might use to order coffee. Sophia blinked, certain she'd misheard, but his expression remained perfectly serious. He explained that his grandfather's will contained a clause requiring him to be married before his 35th birthday, still 3 months away, or forfeit control of the family company to his cousin Marcus, a man whose business practices bordered on criminal. The lawyers had found no way around the archaic provision, and every woman in his social circle came with complications, hidden agendas, or family connections that would create more problems than solutions. He needed someone clean, someone unconnected to his world, someone who could play the part convincingly for exactly 1 year before they quietly divorced and went their separate ways. In exchange, he offered $10 million and complete freedom to pursue whatever dreams she'd been postponing. Sophia stared at him, wondering if this was some elaborate hidden camera show or if she'd finally snapped under the pressure and was now hallucinating billionaire proposals in airport terminals. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was insane, that normal people didn't make such offers to strangers in wedding dresses, but the desperate part whispered that this might be exactly the escape she needed. Alexander pulled up photos on his tablet. A sprawling Manhattan penthouse, a house in the Hamptons, another in Aspen, and a vineyard in Tuscany where she could live during their arrangement. All of it would be hers to enjoy, along with a generous monthly allowance and access to anything she needed to maintain the facade of being his wife. He spoke about charity galas and business dinners, about the social obligations that would be required, but also about the freedom she'd have to pursue her photography, a detail that startled her since she hadn't mentioned her abandoned artistic ambitions to anyone in years. When she asked how he knew, he simply smiled and said he'd made it his business to read people quickly and accurately. It was a skill that had served him well in boardrooms and hostile takeovers. As she listened to him outline the terms of their potential arrangement, Sophia realized this man had somehow seen more of her true self in 30 minutes than James had in 3 years of dating and engagement. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She found herself studying Alexander's hands as he spoke, noting the absence of tan lines or calluses that would suggest he'd ever worn a wedding ring, the expensive watch that probably cost more than most people's cars, and the way his fingers moved with unconscious elegance across the tablet screen. "What makes you think I'd be suitable for this?" Sophia asked, finally finding her voice. Alexander's smile turned rueful as he explained that he'd been watching her for the past hour, observing how she carried herself despite being in an obviously difficult situation. She had natural grace, an understated elegance that couldn't be taught or bought, and most importantly, she seemed genuine in a way that was rare in his experience. When she pressed him about his own situation, he revealed that he'd been married once before, in his 20s, to his college sweetheart. It had been real love, the kind that poets wrote about and movies celebrated, but Rebecca had died in a car accident just 6 months after their wedding. The loss had nearly destroyed him, and in the 8 years since, he'd thrown himself into building his empire, using work as both shield and weapon against the possibility of ever feeling that vulnerable again. His grandfather's clause wasn't just about the company. It was the old man's final attempt to force Alexander back into the land of the living, to make him remember that business success meant nothing without someone to share it with. The irony that he was now proposing a marriage of convenience wasn't lost on him, but desperate times called for creative solutions. As their flight began boarding, Sophia felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Behind her lay a life carefully constructed by other people's expectations, a fiancé who loved the idea of her more than the reality, parents who valued appearance over happiness, and a future that felt like a beautiful prison. Ahead of her lay Barcelona and the uncertain freedom of starting over with nothing but her savings and her abandoned dreams. But sitting beside her was a third option, one so impossible it might actually work. Alexander wasn't asking for her heart or her soul, just her name and her presence for 12 months. In return, he offered not just financial security, but the space to discover who she might become, without the weight of everyone else's needs and wants defining her choices. She thought about the photography equipment gathering dust in her closet, about the gallery showings she'd dreamed of but never pursued, about the version of herself that had been slowly suffocating under layers of compromise and accommodation. When the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, Alexander stood and extended his hand, not as a demand, but as an invitation. The choice, he made clear, was entirely hers. No pressure, no consequences if she declined, just an opportunity that might never come again. Sophia looked at his outstretched hand and realized this was the first real choice anyone had offered her in years. "If I say yes," Sophia said, her heart hammering against her ribs, "what happens next?" Alexander's expression remained carefully neutral as he explained the logistics. They would fly to Las Vegas instead of Barcelona, marry in a simple ceremony that night, and return to New York as husband and wife. His lawyers would have the contracts ready within 24 hours, detailing every aspect of their arrangement and ensuring her financial security regardless of what happened. She would have her own room in his penthouse, complete autonomy over her schedule and activities, and access to any resources she needed to build the life she'd always wanted. The only requirements were public appearances at key events and maintaining the illusion of their marriage for anyone outside their inner circle. As he spoke, Sophia realized this man was offering her something she'd never had before. A partnership built on honesty rather than pretense, clear expectations rather than unspoken assumptions, and the freedom to be herself rather than who others needed her to be. When she finally placed her hand in his, accepting the most insane proposition of her life, she felt a rush of terror and exhilaration that was better than any drug. For the first time in years, she had no idea what would happen next, and it was absolutely thrilling. Their flight to Las Vegas was surreal, filled with quiet conversations about logistics and boundaries, about expectations and contingencies. Alexander was surprisingly easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor and an obvious intelligence that made the hours pass quickly. He told her about his company, about the innovative technologies they were developing, about his passion for sustainable energy and social responsibility. She found herself sharing her own dreams, her love of capturing light and shadow through her camera lens, her desire to document stories that mattered. By the time they landed, some of the awkwardness had faded, replaced by something that felt almost like friendship. The wedding chapel was exactly what she'd expected, slightly tacky but oddly charming, with an Elvis impersonator and plastic flowers. Yet when Alexander slipped the simple platinum band onto her finger and spoke the words that bound them together, however temporarily, Sophia felt a strange sense of rightness. This wasn't the fairy tale wedding she'd fled from, but it was honest in a way that had been missing from her relationship with James. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander's kiss was brief and respectful, but she felt the warmth of his lips long after they separated. Their first month as husband and wife was an education in the strange intimacy of shared space without shared hearts. Alexander's penthouse was a masterpiece of modern design, all clean lines and spectacular views, with a corner room he'd converted into a photography studio complete with professional lighting and darkroom equipment. When she'd stared at him in shock, he'd simply shrugged and said he believed in investing in talent. Their public appearances were carefully choreographed affairs, charity dinners where she learned to navigate conversations about art and philanthropy, business gatherings where she discovered an unexpected talent for reading people and situations. Alexander was an attentive husband in public, always touching her hand or back, whispering comments that made her laugh genuinely, creating the impression of a couple deeply in love. In private, they maintained polite distance, sharing morning coffee and comfortable silence, respecting each other's space and schedules. Yet Sophia found herself looking forward to their conversations, to his insights about the world, to the way he listened when she talked about her growing portfolio of street photography. She was documenting the city with new eyes, capturing moments of genuine human connection that seemed more authentic than anything in her previous life. 3 months into their arrangement, Sophia realized she was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble they'd anticipated: media scrutiny, family pressure, business complications, but something far more dangerous. She was falling for her husband. It started small, with appreciation for his quiet kindness, his respect for her boundaries, his genuine interest in her dreams. But it grew into something deeper as she watched him work, saw how he treated his employees, witnessed his passion for making the world better through technology and philanthropy. Alexander was nothing like the cold, calculating businessman she'd expected. He was brilliant and driven, yes, but also wounded and lonely, carrying his grief like armor that protected him from further loss. She began noticing small things: how he took his coffee, the way he absently rubbed his left temple when he was thinking, the genuine smile that transformed his entire face when something truly amused him. The worst part was the growing suspicion that her feelings might be reciprocated. She caught him watching her sometimes, his expression unguarded and vulnerable, and felt the air between them crackle with possibility. But their contract was clear: no emotional complications, no expectations beyond their agreed terms. She was supposed to be playing a role, not living a reality, and the line between performance and truth was becoming dangerously blurred. The crisis came in the form of Marcus Stone, Alexander's cousin, who arrived at a charity gala with accusations and photographs that threatened to destroy everything. He'd hired investigators to dig into Sophia's past, uncovering her abandoned wedding, her hasty marriage to Alexander, and enough circumstantial evidence to suggest their relationship was fraudulent. Standing in the middle of Manhattan's most exclusive ballroom, surrounded by society's elite, Marcus publicly challenged the legitimacy of their marriage, demanding proof of genuine affection and threatening to expose what he called an obvious business arrangement designed to circumvent our grandfather's will. The room fell silent. 300 pairs of eyes focused on them, cameras flashing as reporters sensed a story that would dominate headlines for weeks. Alexander's hand found hers, his grip steady and warm, and for a moment she saw past his carefully controlled exterior to the vulnerable man beneath. This was his worst nightmare: public humiliation, the loss of everything he'd worked to build, the validation of his deepest fear that he was destined to lose everything he cared about. In that instant, Sophia realized that somewhere along the way, their convenient arrangement had become inconveniently real, at least for her. The question was whether Alexander felt the same way, or if she was about to sacrifice her heart for a man who still saw her as nothing more than a beautiful solution to an ugly problem. "You want proof?" Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom as she stepped closer to Alexander. She reached up to cup his face in her hands, looking directly into his startled grey eyes as she spoke words that were no longer part of any performance. "I love this man. Not his money, not his status, not what he can give me, but him. I love his brilliant mind and his generous heart. I love how he sees the world and wants to make it better. I love that he gave me space to become who I was meant to be, instead of demanding I become who he needed me to be." Alexander's expression shifted from shock to something deeper, more vulnerable, as she continued. "Our marriage might have started as a business arrangement, but it became real the moment I stopped pretending to be his wife and started actually being her." The ballroom held its collective breath as Alexander's hands covered hers, his voice rough with emotion when he finally spoke. "Sophia is right. We may have married for practical reasons, but I love her for impractical ones. She makes me want to be the man she sees when she looks at me, and that's worth more than any inheritance." Marcus's accusations seemed to crumble in the face of such raw honesty, and the crowd's hostility transformed into something warmer, more supportive. But Sophia barely noticed the audience anymore. She was lost in Alexander's eyes, seeing her own feelings reflected back at her with an intensity that took her breath away. 6 months later, Sophia stood in her first solo photography exhibition, surrounded by images that told the story of a city and its people with unprecedented intimacy and honesty. The gallery was packed with collectors, critics, and friends, but her eyes kept finding Alexander across the room, his pride in her accomplishment evident in every line of his body. They'd torn up their original contract the morning after the gala, choosing instead to build something real together, day by day, choice by choice. It hadn't been easy. Learning to love someone while learning to trust yourself requires a kind of courage that Sophia had never needed before. But Alexander had been patient with her fears, just as she'd been patient with his, and together they'd created something neither had thought possible. A partnership built on genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared dreams. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Alexander found her standing before her favorite photograph, a candid shot of an elderly couple sharing coffee at a street cafe, their hands intertwined across a small table, their faces lined with years of love and compromise and joy. "No regrets?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Sophia leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blade. "Only one," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "I regret that it took running away from the wrong marriage to find the right husband." Alexander's laugh was warm and free, the sound of a man who'd finally learned that love wasn't something to fear, but something to celebrate, and as he kissed her in the soft gallery lighting, Sophia knew she'd never run from anything again. Thank you so much for listening to Sophia and Alexander's story. We hope it reminded you that sometimes the most unexpected detours lead us exactly where we're meant to be. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from and whether you believe in second chances at love. Your stories and support mean the world to us, and we can't wait to share more tales of love, courage, and new beginnings with you. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to choose your own adventure.